It was New Year's Eve in 2017. I'm from a small town near Cleveland, Ohio, and I was flying home after finishing a semester at the University of Rochester. I'd stayed an extra week after the semester ended for personal reasons, so I spent Christmas mostly by myself. The flight itself was uneventful, but I was already in a bad mood before boarding. I'm a die-hard Browns fan, and while waiting at the airport, I found out the Browns had lost their final game of the season, ending the year at 0-16, completely winless. As a lifelong fan, it was a special kind of disappointment. To make things worse, my flight was delayed, throwing off my family's New Year's Eve plans. We'd planned to drive together to my cousin's house for a party and stay overnight. But because of the delay, my parents left early without me, taking the main car. That left me to drive our spare car alone. To cheer me up, my mom left our golden retriever, Vera, at home so she could ride along with me. I wasn't thrilled about driving alone, but at least Vera would keep me company. By the time I got home from the airport, it was almost 10 p.m. I didn't bother unpacking. I just threw my bags in the car, got Vera, locked up the house, and hit the road. The drive wasn't anything special, just miles of Ohio back roads cutting through fields and woods. There wasn't much snow on the ground, just a light layer, which was a relief since I hate driving in the snow. But it was pitch dark. The only light came from my car's headlights and the occasional farmhouse porch light in the distance. About halfway into the trip, Vera started whining. At first, I thought she just wanted attention, but then she stood up and began pacing in the passenger seat. That's when I realized she needed to go. I sighed and pulled over at the next clearing, which was barely big enough for my car. It was so dark outside that if not for the patches of snow, I wouldn't have been able to see anything beyond the trees. I bundled up against the cold and let Viri out without bothering to leash her. She sniffed around the edge of the woods, taking her time. That's when I heard it. A loud crashing sound came from the trees. It wasn't just a branch breaking. It was heavier, deliberate, like something big moving through the forest. The noise made me jump. It sounded like someone sprinting through the woods. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see past the first row of trees, but it was impossible to make anything out. Before I could react, Vera bolted into the woods. She disappeared into the trees so fast I couldn't stop her. I yelled her name, but she didn't come back. My heart was racing, and the cold air was making it hard to breathe. I couldn't just leave her out there. Without thinking, I ran into the woods calling for her as I went. I didn't want to imagine what she might be chasing. The only light I had was my phone's flashlight and the faint snow on the ground. The forest was so dark that I kept running into trees. I just ran, hoping I'd find her before she reached whatever was out there. My lungs were burning from the cold by the time I had to stop and catch my breath. I leaned against a tree, feeling completely helpless. Then, out of nowhere, I saw her. She was crouched low, trembling, and walking slowly toward me with her tail tucked between her legs. I'd never seen her look so scared. I dropped to my knees and hugged her, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. But I could feel her shaking, and it was clear that something had terrified her. That's when I realized we weren't out of danger yet. Whatever was in the woods was still out there. I got up quickly and told Vera to follow me. She stuck by my side this time, as if her life depended on it. I tried to head back to the car, but I wasn't sure I was going the right way. Then I heard more crashing behind me, and my heart nearly stopped. Without thinking, I grabbed Vera and started running. Vera darted ahead of me, and I followed her as fast as I could, praying I wouldn't trip. The crashing sound behind us didn't stop. It felt like it was chasing us. I can't even begin to explain how terrified I was. I genuinely thought I might not make it. Somehow Vera led me straight back to the car. I threw her inside and slammed the door shut. As I scrambled into the driver's seat, I glanced toward the woods. My stomach dropped. 3 figures stood at the tree line, just watching us. My hands shook as I jammed the keys into the ignition, and I floored it out of there. I didn't slow down or stop. I was in complete shock. It wasn't until I'd driven a few miles that I realized Vera was bleeding. Panic set in as I noticed a cut below her shoulder blade. Someone had stabbed her. I slammed on the brakes, jumped out of the car, and ran to the trunk. Thankfully, my mom always kept a first aid kit in every car, and for once, her obsession with being prepared paid off. I cleaned the wound as best as I could and wrapped it in gauze. Vera whimpered, and I worried I was hurting her, but I knew I had to do it. For the first time since this nightmare began, I started to relax. It was finally over. I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind for the rest of the drive, but I was so shaken. I didn't tell my family what happened. I don't know why. It just felt like something I couldn't explain. This next part is another story I often think about, especially around this time of year. It happened on a different New Year's Eve when I was driving to my parents' house in Pennsylvania to celebrate with them. The trip was a few hours, so I left in the late afternoon to arrive early. I usually enjoy long drives. It gives me time to clear my head, but this drive turned out to be anything but relaxing. About an hour into the drive, snow started falling. At first it was light, just a few flurries that made the windshield look pretty. I even thought to myself how peaceful it looked, but I must have jinxed it because the snow started coming down harder. Soon, it was a full-on blizzard. The highway was slick, and I could barely see anything. My little sedan was struggling to handle even the smallest hills, and I knew it wasn't safe to keep going. I pulled over to the shoulder, far enough off the road to avoid other cars. Not that there were many. I texted my parents to let them know, and they were really worried. I tried to reassure them, but truthfully, I wasn't feeling confident. I figured the storm would ease up eventually, and I'd be able to continue. But the snow just kept falling, piling up around the car and on the road. After about an hour, I accepted that I wasn't going anywhere that night. My dad offered to come get me, but I told him that would be way too dangerous. Instead, I promised to call the police if things got worse, which he reluctantly agreed to. I didn't want to call the police unless it was absolutely necessary, and I didn't have AAA, so that wasn't an option. I decided to wait until I was too tired to stay awake, and if the snow hadn't stopped by then, I'd make the call. The idea of spending the night in my car made me really uneasy. I didn't want to run out of gas or kill the battery trying to keep the heat on. So, I sat there in the dark, turning the engine on and off to conserve fuel. The wind outside howled, and the isolation started to weigh on me. Then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. Relief washed over me. A snowplow was pulling up behind me. I couldn't believe my luck. The driver stopped next to my car and rolled down his window. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, wearing a thick jacket and a black knit hat. His face looked weathered, like he'd spent years working in harsh conditions. I expected him to say something right away, but he just stared at me for what felt like an uncomfortably long time. Finally, he asked if I was okay. He had a rough, gravelly voice, the kind you'd expect from a heavy smoker, and it honestly put me on edge. I told him I didn't think my car could handle the weather, trying to sound polite while keeping my nerves in check. He nodded and said I wouldn't get far in this storm, especially in a car like mine. There was a pause as he seemed to think about something. His eyes scanned my back seat, like he was searching for something, which made me uneasy. Just as I was about to say something, he offered to give me a ride. I hesitated. I didn't know him, and while he seemed a little odd, he also came across as genuine. Plus, staying in my car all night felt like a terrible idea. I asked if he could take me to my parents' house, and he said it wouldn't be a problem. When I asked about my car, he shrugged and told me to leave it. After a moment of hesitation, I agreed. I grabbed my bag and climbed into the cab of the snowplow. At first, the warmth felt comforting, and I could feel some of the tension leaving my shoulders as I settled into the seat. He asked where I was headed, so I told him about my parents' house and gave him directions. He nodded, but didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't uncomfortable at first, but as the minutes passed, I started feeling uneasy. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't heading in the direction of my parents' house. I knew because the GPS on my phone was pointing the opposite way. We were on a local highway with only two possible directions, so I was sure we were going the wrong way. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked if we were on the right track. His demeanor shifted slightly at my question. Without looking at me, he said we were taking a shortcut and that the back roads would be better than the highway. I didn't know the area well enough to argue, but the way he said it made my stomach knot. We kept driving, and soon he turned off the highway onto a smaller road. My GPS adjusted and showed we were heading in the right direction again, so I told myself I was probably overthinking it. Still, something about him felt off, and I started paying closer attention to my surroundings. That's when I noticed the red flags. Empty liquor bottles were rolling around near his feet. Torn maps were stuffed into the side pockets, and I spotted a knife wedged between the seats. My heart started racing so hard, it felt like it might burst out of my chest. By then, I was sure we weren't going the right way. The GPS kept recalibrating as he ignored turn after turn, not even glancing at it. I was panicking, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, I saw a house in the distance, the only one I'd seen for miles. It felt like my only chance. As we got closer, I took a deep breath, grabbed the door handle, and kicked the door open as hard as I could. The freezing air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my leg, but I scrambled to my feet and started running toward the house. The man yelled something behind me, and when I glanced back, I saw him rummaging in the glove box, maybe for a gun. I didn't look back again. I ran through the snow as fast as I could, slipping and stumbling until I reached the house. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. A man and woman opened the door and quickly pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Through tears and shaking, I told them what had just happened. They didn't ask many questions. They just called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They promised to search the area, but with the storm, it was unlikely they'd find him. The couple drove me to my parents' house and even helped arrange for my car to be towed. I was beyond grateful for their kindness. My dad was furious when he heard the whole story. And since then, I've refused to drive in the snow. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't jumped out of that truck. It's a chilling memory I'll carry with me forever. I'm from a rural part of northwestern Ontario. This happened a couple of years ago. Since I was a kid, my dad and his friends had a New Year's Eve tradition of going ice fishing while others celebrated the way they wanted. My mom wasn't really in the picture, and we didn't have much extended family. So I spent most New Year's Eves on a frozen lake with my dad, uncle, brother, and my dad's buddies. My dad has passed away now, and my brother moved to Chicago years ago. But I still try to keep up the tradition of ice fishing on New Year's Eve. I'm not entirely sure why. It just feels like something I'm supposed to do. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, usually join me. They're the rugged outdoorsy type. Guys who look like they belong in the wilderness more than anywhere else. Honestly, I'm the same way. The three of us have done our best to keep the tradition alive, and it's been great, considering spending New Year's alone would be pretty depressing. Nate was driving that day. He has the perfect truck for it. Big tires, four-wheel drive, and plenty of space for our gear. We packed everything: rods, tip-ups, bait, a sled to haul our stuff, and a pop-up shelter to shield us from the cold. The weather forecast said it would be clear, but in Ontario you never fully trust that. We thought we were ready for anything. The lake we were heading to isn't a popular spot, which is why we love it. It's hidden, surrounded by dense trees, with ice that stays thick even in milder winters. It's not a place you'd find by accident. You have to know where to go. As Nate navigated the snowy back roads, the excitement was building. There's something peaceful about ice fishing. Just you, your friends, and the hope of a good catch. It's way better than drinking all night at a bar. When we parked near the trailhead, I noticed someone standing a few yards away. He was bundled up in heavy winter gear, but something about him felt off. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at our truck. At first I thought maybe he was another angler checking us out, but then I saw him glance at his phone, then back at us, and back at his phone again. It didn't seem casual. I can't explain it, but it gave me a bad feeling. I told my friends the guy was giving me the creeps. Trevor shrugged, and Nate nodded without saying much. We were about to unload the truck when the man suddenly ran toward us, waving his arms like crazy. I rolled down the window to hear him. He was yelling that we needed to help him, saying his friend had fallen through the ice. He pointed at his phone, claiming the other guy had just messaged him. He sounded frantic, and his panic felt real. Trevor immediately got out of the truck, and before we knew it, we were all following him down the trail to the lake. We didn't grab anything, not even our jackets. His urgency overrode any doubts we might have had. The man was practically running, and we had to jog to keep up. As we got closer to the lake, I noticed something strange. He wasn't taking us to the usual fishing spots. Instead, we were heading to a more remote part of the shoreline, where the ice wasn't as solid. I started to feel uneasy, but it was too late. Suddenly, two more men came into view. They were standing near the lake's edge, not dressed for fishing and not moving. They were just standing there, waiting. Then I noticed their hands. They were holding guns. My stomach dropped. One of the men yelled at us to stop, pointing his gun right at me. There's no way to describe what it feels like to have a gun aimed at you. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. The man who had led us there turned around, a smirk spreading across his face. That's when I realized we'd been set up. We'd been set up. The second guy demanded Nate's truck keys, along with everything we had on us. There wasn't much we could do. They weren't bluffing. Nate pulled out his keys and tossed them to the man, and the three of us emptied our pockets. I tried to hold on to my phone, but one of them barked, "Phones too." Nate said his phone was in the truck, which made them laugh. I was furious. How could we have fallen for this? My fists clenched, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to fight back. But they had the upper hand, and we knew better than to try anything. Within minutes, they'd taken everything and forced us back up the trail at gunpoint. One of them hopped into Nate's truck and sped off, while the other two disappeared into the woods, probably heading to their own vehicle. For a brief second, I thought about chasing after them, but what good would that have done? We stood there, frozen in disbelief and literally freezing from the cold. That's when Nate reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Turns out, he had lied about leaving it in the truck. I have no idea what we would have done if he hadn't thought so quickly. Luckily, we still had cell service. He called the police, keeping his voice steady as he explained what had happened. The dispatcher told us to stay where we were, so we huddled together for warmth while we waited for help. I was still boiling with anger. Nate was even worse. He kept kicking trees and yelling every curse word imaginable. Trevor and I tried to calm him down, but honestly, we were all shaken. The whole thing had happened so fast that I was still trying to process it. What were those guys even doing out there, in the middle of nowhere? On New Year's Eve? None of it made sense. To skip over the boring parts, the cops eventually arrived, took our statements, and gave us a ride back to Trevor's house since it was closest. Unsurprisingly, Nate's truck was never found, and the guys who robbed us were never caught. Even now, the three of us can't wrap our heads around what happened. Trevor thinks we just got unlucky, that those guys weren't planning to rob anyone, but saw us as an easy target. Maybe he's right, but it still doesn't add up to me. Who just happens to set up a trap in such a remote spot without knowing someone will come by? On the other hand, it seems unlikely they'd been waiting specifically for us. Honestly, I have no idea what to make of it. The whole thing feels like a bad dream I can't shake off.